Hello viewers, today we discuss George Meredith's novel The Egoist. Written in 1879 and subtitled A Comedy and Narrative, The Egoist is rated as one of the finest novels to have been written during the Victorian era. Meredith's style of writing was such that 20th century literary critics and several authors including Sir Conan Doyle, E.M. Forster and Virginia Woolf refer to the novel The Egoist. The novel, set in picturesque English countryside, deals with the marriage of Sir Willoughby, a wealthy narcissist landlord. The events surrounding Willoughby's engagement and eventual rejection of marriage are dealt humorously. And before we proceed further, let us examine the life of Meredith. George Meredith, an English writer born in 1828 in Portsmouth, died in 1909 in Surrey. He was a Victorian writer whose prominent works include Diana of Crossways, The Ordeal of Richard Feverel, and an essay on comedy, and Modern Love, which is a collection of sonnets about love. Meredith's father and grandfather worked for the English Navy. His mother died early in life and Meredith was sent to Germany to pursue school education. Though trained for a career in law, Meredith chose to work as a journalist and as a writer. As the founder editor of Monthly Observer, a literary magazine, in 1949, Meredith was exposed to London's literary scene. Meredith was acquainted with Sir Thomas Love Peacock and married his daughter Mary Ellen Nichols. Meredith was also well acquainted with the Pre-Raphaelites, particularly the painter Henry Wallace. In 1856, Meredith posed as the male model for Wallace's picture The Death of Chatterton. However, Ellen eloped with Henry Wallace and the breakup affected Meredith. Meredith developed serious psychological issues and his health deteriorated. After the estrangement, Meredith wrote his first major novel, The Ordeal of Richard Feverel, which was published in 1859. Some of his finest sonnets were written after his breakup and they were published as Modern Love. The novel and collection of poems were largely autobiographical. The events in The Ordeal of Richard Feverel are similar to the events that happened in the life of Meredith. The characters in the novel are based on the personalities of Ellen, Wallace and Meredith. The sonnets in the collection Modern Love reflect the pain and the anguish that the separation caused to Meredith. Ellen's death in 1859 was reflected in his writings as well. Meredith married Mary Williamy in 1864 and settled in Surrey. After the marriage, Meredith devoted his life to writing. Nature fascinated him. His writings were replete with imagery and has numerous indirect references. Meredith understood the scope of comedy better than any of his contemporaries, and his essay on comedy, which was published in 1877, is still relevant to the modern world. His writings address the social issues relevant to the middle and the late Victorian period. For instance, in the novel The Egoist, Meredith addressed the issue of women subjugation. Meredith was popular amongst his contemporaries and counted most of the prominent literary figures of his lifetime as close friends. Yet, for most of his career, Meredith had difficulty achieving popular success. His first truly successful novel was Diana of the Crossways, which was published in 1885. Meredith's writing style won him many admirers among his contemporaries. His writings, as we already noted, won him the compliments from Sir Conan Doyle, E.M. Forster and Virginia Woolf. Forster discussed Meredith's work in detail in his Aspects of Novel and deemed The Egoist had a perfect plot. Oscar Wilde, in The Decay of Lying, exclaimed, "Ah, Meredith, who can define him? His style is chaos illuminated by flashes of lightning." The quality of his work aided him in being nominated the President of the Society of Authors in England. and he succeeded Lord Tennyson as the president of the society. Meredith was awarded the Order of the Empire in 1905. Dear friends, now let us examine the novel. The Egoist was not Meredith's most popular novel. Diana of the Crossways was his most loved work. But The Egoist has a fascinating plot through which Meredith portrayed a true picture of life in the English countryside. Using the novel, especially the dialogues of Sir Willoughby Patterne, who was the Egoist, and the interactions that he had with other characters in the novel, Meredith points out the frivolous and the trivial thoughts that men conceive. The protagonist is a self-conceited, wealthy landlord who is only interested in being praised by everyone around him. The novel was serialized in the Glasgow Weekly Herald in 1879. Much of the plot is revealed through dialogues between the characters. Meredith sandwiches his take on the nature of men, women and the Victorian society between these dialogues. The novel is situated amidst romance and marriage of Willoughby. In the opening chapters of the book, Sir Willoughby Patterne, the Baron of Patterne, is engaged and is to be married to Constantia Durham. However, Constantia abruptly runs away with Captain Oxford. The countryside is sympathetic to Willoughby. Willoughby pretends that the sudden estrangement and elopement of Constantia has no effect on him. He seems to be courting Leticia Dale, who was the daughter of his tenant. Leticia has always been devoted to Willoughby. She listens to his discourse. However, instead of marrying Leticia, Sir Willoughby undertakes a trip round the world. Upon his return, he is not interested in Leticia. While the country speculates that Willoughby will meet Mr. Dale and pursue the issue of marriage, Willoughby speaks to Dale only of renewing his lease to the cottage. Vernon Whitford, a literary scholar and a cousin of Willoughby, resides in London in order to pursue a literary career. Willoughby thinks such efforts are worthless and persuades Mr. Whitford to return to the Patterne Hall and asks him to work as his secretary. At Patterne, Whitford takes long walks with Leticia and educates Crossjay Patterne. Crossjay, a young boy, is a relative of Sir Willoughby. Willoughby houses him at the Patterne Hall. Whitford thinks that Crossjay is best suited for a career in Navy, but he is unable to bear the expenditure. He urges Willoughby to fund Crossjay's education for a career in Navy. However, Willoughby wants to make Crossjay a gentleman. Sir Willoughby is introduced to Clara Middleton. He successfully woos Clara and she agrees to an engagement. She is beautiful and young. Clara states that she would like to travel before the marriage. Sir Willoughby refuses and convinces her father, Reverend Dr. Middleton, to be housed at Patterne. He plans to convince Clara to an early marriage and seeks to impose his views upon her. During his conversation, he never listens to Clara and seeks to win her into his egoistic orbit. He attempts to doctor all her desires so that they accord with his. When Clara protests that she would like to love the world and serve it so that it might be better, Sir Willoughby deems such ideas naive and childish. The conversations that happen between Willoughby and Clara are not amicable. She refuses to submit to his ego. Hence, Sir Willoughby manages to secure the confidence of Dr. Middleton. Middleton is a well-meaning, idealistic scholar whose speech is complicated. Unfortunately for Clara, he is prone to patriarchal ideas and does not accept Clara's pleas for travelling before the marriage. Dr. Middleton likes Patterne. He is happy with the company of Vernon Whitford and adores Willoughby's collection of wine. He is reluctant to leave the Patterne Hall. Clara likes the company of Whitford and Crossjay. Crossjay is devoted to her. Whitford seeks her help to plead Crossjay's case with Willoughby. When she intervenes on behalf of Crossjay's career, Willoughby is angry and refuses to listen further. Thus, in a matter of few weeks, Clara begins to assume that she is being stifled by Willoughby. It is very clear that things are not smooth between the lovers. It is at this time that Willoughby assumes that Leticia could be brought in to convince Clara. This idea makes it worse for Willoughby. When Clara meets Leticia Dale, Clara understands that Leticia would make a better match for the egoistic Sir Willoughby. Clara asks Willoughby for her own freedom and informs him that he should settle down with Leticia. Willoughby deems that Clara's words are inspired by jealousy. Willoughby refuses to believe that Clara would not want to marry him. Willoughby contrives a scheme to get Leticia married to Whitford instead. He asks Clara to convince Vernon. Instead, Clara informs Vernon about her predicament. She informs him that she doesn't want to settle down with Willoughby. However, Vernon is not responsive and does not encourage her efforts. Clara becomes restless and attempts to unburden to Leticia. Since Leticia offers no responses, Clara begins to walk herself. Meanwhile, Colonel de Craye, a dashing handsome man, arrives in the town. He boards a carriage at the station which is being driven by the drunk driver Flitch. The colonel is supposed to function as Willoughby's best man at the wedding. Flitch is drunk and he swears the carriage away from the road as to avoid running down Clara. The porcelain vase which the colonel has brought as a wedding present is broken. The colonel gets down the carriage and gets acquainted with Clara and walks beside her to the Pattern Hall. Clara and the colonel instantly strike up a friendly relationship. The colonel understands that things aren't fine between the lovers. The arrival of colonel marks another twist in the novel. Willoughby is unable to comprehend the loyalties of the colonel. Sir Willoughby assumes and imagines that Clara has revealed her problems to the colonel. He assumes that the colonel is in love with Clara already. His suspicion makes Pattern Hall a gloomy place. As he learns about the accident that led to the colonel meeting Clara in the first place, he banishes Flitch from the estate. The egoist now seems to be making things difficult for himself. Clara feels suffocated at the Pattern Hall and plans to escape the confinement. She writes to her bridesmaid Lucy Darlington and asks her to arrange accommodation in London. She convinces her father that she needs a vacation before the marriage. However, Willoughby intervenes and manages to trick Dr. Middleton with expensive wines and foils Clara's plans. Clara decides to run away and sneaks out to the railway station with Crossjay as a guide. She is caught in a storm. The men from the estate search for her and Vernon Whitford finds her at the railway station. Whitford offers her medicines to prevent her from catching a cold. He urges her to consider the situation carefully and think of her father and Crossjay. Clara thinks about her situation and decides to go ahead with the plan. Vernon supports her and also distracts Mrs. Mountstuart, who is present at the station. However, the colonel has guessed Clara's intentions and he arrives at the station. Finally, Clara decides to return to Pattern Hall. Despite de Craye's efforts to cover up Clara's escapade, Willoughby manages to find out that Clara was at the station. Willoughby assumes that Clara is in love with de Craye and that they were planning to elope. He realizes that Crossjay aided Clara in escaping from the Pattern Hall. He banishes Crossjay from the estate as well. Clara continues to seek her freedom and Willoughby continues to refuse to give it to her. At last, Willoughby is tired and begins to convince himself that Leticia is a better choice. Willoughby consults Leticia at midnight and is stunned when she refuses him. Crossjay, who is homeless, returns to Patterne that night and eavesdrops on the conversations between Leticia and Sir Willoughby. Crossjay is loyal to Clara and intends to brief Vernon Whitford on what he has heard and seen. De Cray, however, talks to Crossjay first and comprehends the situation. De Cray informs Clara about the details of the midnight conversation. Clara confronts Willoughby in the presence of her father. Comprehending that he has little choice, Willoughby admits that he has indeed proposed a marriage to Leticia. The reason for this is that Willoughby has arrogantly assumed that De Cray is the lover of Clara. He seeks to avenge against Clara. He informs her that she would be free of the engagement only if she were to marry Vernon, his cousin. He plans to deny Clara her lover and thereby punish her. Unknown to Willoughby, Clara likes Vernon and Vernon is in love with Clara. Hence, the engagement that Willoughby forces upon them is beneficial to both Clara and Vernon. Leticia eventually agrees to marry Sir Willoughby. Her father's financial state and the pressure of the town compel her to agree for the marriage. Leticia, however, states that she would marry Sir Willoughby only if he were to agree to her demands. She calls Willoughby an egoist and promises that she would never love him. She also demands Willoughby to reinstate Flitch, the drunk driver, and Crossjay, who were banished from the Patterne Hall. Sir Willoughby, though crestfallen, agrees and the novel ends with the two pairs settling down. Now that we have examined the plot of The Egoist, let us examine the style in which Meredith wrote the novel The Egoist. The Egoist is a light-hearted novel. Despite the philosophical moorings of the author, which are placed between the conversations, the novel is remarkably witty. Meredith's work, which is subtitled A Comedy in Narrative, is not satirical. It is neither a satire nor does it fit into the subgenre comedy of manners. Instead, true to his arguments in the essay on comedy, which was originally titled On the Idea of Comedy and the Uses of Comic Spirit, Meredith's The Egoist is meant neither for the elastic nor for the hypergalactic. The narrative is not meant for those who cannot laugh or for those who laugh at the silliest of jokes. The narrative draws its style from the 17th century England satire and comedy of manners. Yet, as stated earlier, it refuses to be slotted amongst the subgenres. The spirit of the novel is more in tune with Pope's The Rape of the Lock. The language is genial and Meredith's generalizations are not harsh. Meredith plays with words. For instance, while describing the character of Willoughby, he states, "Through very love of self himself, he slew." The statement is both sympathetic and hilarious. The narrative, which is divided into 50 chapters, contains a prelude to which Meredith self-depreciatingly added the subtitle, a chapter of which the last page only is of any importance. However, the first paragraph of the novel states that comedy is a game played to throw reflections upon social life, and it deals with human nature in the drawing room of civilized men and women. Like most of the 19th century masters of prose, Meredith's humor is most evident when he provides his take on the situation. For instance, while describing the nature of Willoughby, he states his admirable passion to excel was chiefly directed in his youth upon sport, and so great was the passion in him that it was commonly the presence of rivals which led him to the declaration of love. However, Meredith is kind in his treatment of the average men and women. Much of the criticism is reserved for men of importance like Willoughby and Reverend Dr. Middleton. The trespasses of well-meaning characters including Vernon Whitford, Clara, Crossjay and even the Colonel Grey are dealt with sympathy. Now friends, let us examine the dominant themes in the novel The Egoist. The Egoist, as we have noted, was published in 1879 and it is one of the more mature works of Meredith. By 1879, Meredith came under the influence of the Pre-Raphaelites. He was also influenced by John Ruskin. Meredith observed society keenly. He was aware of the politics of class and gender. He was sympathetic towards women and loathed the landed gentry. In the novel, through the character of Willoughby, Meredith launches a subtle attack on the nature of the gentry. Willoughby is portrayed as a snob who patronizes everybody around him. However, the character of Willoughby and Reverend Middleton, who are depicted as patriarchal, conservative men, are important to his artistic design. Willoughby and Middleton are apathetic to the needs of women and assume that women have no feelings. They deny the women agency. The women in the narrative, including the aunts Leticia and Clara, are denied the freedom to choose their partners. The novel is also a commentary on the dynamics of class relations in the Victorian society. Crossjay and Vernon are financially dependent on Willoughby. It is not to state that either Vernon or Crossjay were poor. They were middle-class men who were, for the time being, dependent on the largesse of their cousin. Willoughby assumes that both of them are unable to decide for themselves. He wants to decide their futures. It is very clear that Willoughby is not interested in their careers. It is just that he is in a position to inform them and they are in no position but to listen to him that compels him to decide their fate. The carriage driver is banished for an accident. Willoughby assumes he has the right to decide whom Leticia marries. He arrogantly banishes Crossjay from Patterne. He disowns a relative as he finds that he is dressed shoddily. However, towards the end of the narrative, the meek, with due support from Colonel de Grey, successfully outdo Willoughby. The narrative provides us an insight into the dynamics of the Victorian society, the trouble that women and those who are financially dependent on the landed class are portrayed very vividly. From the beginning of the novel till its conclusion, Willoughby assumes that he has the control over his friends and family. It does not matter to him that Leticia might not find him attractive, might not find him suitable. It does not occur to him that women might have minds of their own. He assumes that given his position, he is in a position to decide the other's feelings towards him. He is a control freak who wants to have absolute control over the situation. However, there is also his alter ego, Colonel de Grey, who prevents it from happening. The characters Colonel de Grey, Reverend Middleton and Willoughby are all men. They are financially independent and are very rich. But for these three characters, the rest of the characters in the novel are in some way or the other dependent on the largesse of men who are landed and have property. Dear friends, in this lesson, we have discussed the summary of the novel The Egoist. In the next lesson, we would be dealing about the important characters and the themes that have been discussed in the novel The Egoist. It was nice meeting you all now, and we will be seeing you again in the next lesson. Thank you.